hodgepodge, a mixture of dissimilar ingredients. In Nova Scotia, a creamy stew made with a medley of fresh garden vegetables. In Lunenburg, a mixture of garden variety people who, when allowed to mingle in the pot, transform the town into a delicious feast.
The men and all my cousins and uncles were tough guys.
I came for 1 year, by the way. My idea was to get some experience and then go back to Cape Breton, but
I felt like I was losing myself in Toronto.
I think Lunenburg has the capacity to be very progressive.
There is a bit of an issue with come from away sometimes.
It's kind of neat to know somebody whose ancestors came with your ancestors to this community and settled here.
I'm from Nova Scotia, but I've moved to a different Nova Scotia than the one I previously inhabited.
After 4 annual trips, it was starting to get harder and harder to get on the damn plane to go back to Toronto.
I like here everything. I like the ocean.
They came from all over the world, wave upon wave, to Lunenburg. The Acadians,
I would say the first generation saw themselves as Frenchmen.
the Germans,
My ancestors and my wife's ancestors were on the same ship, and that 10, 11 generations later, that we as young children will get together and later marry. It's like history repeating itself.
the Norwegians,
If I might say, I think my father's story is a lot like what we're experiencing today with the Syrian folks and what have you.
You go back and you think about the fact that his country was overrun by Hitler and his group.
They came young and old, some to retire and some to get started in life. They all came with hope. They all came for a better future. Of course, they were not the first peoples to call this land home. There is evidence that people inhabited Nova Scotia 13,000 years ago.
There's a site in Truro in Debert that dates back to 10,500 BC. So the fact that they were in Truro kind of indicates that they were likely, here along the South Shore as well.
This is our town, this is our home, this is the place to be. This is the spot country, no better place to be.
Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. UNESCO World Heritage Site. Colorful architecture, quaint shops, and tall ships. A magical place that has drawn people for millennia and been fought over for centuries. Forever caught between cultures and time, shaped by the Atlantic Ocean and the waves of people who have come to Lunenburg in search of a better life. Every community has its stories, and untold stories. A look into Lunenburg's history is a look into the resilience of a small town. But to understand Lunenburg today, we have to start at the beginning.
My great-grandparents were born on the island of Newfoundland, and before them, my ancestors came from Cape Breton, Digby, the Valley, and La Have.
The Nova Scotia government calls the Mi'kmaq people the founding people of Nova Scotia, and their oral history talks of contact well before Samuel du Champlain.
First contact was likely not with the French and the British. It was likely the Basque fishermen.
In fact, Champlain's navigator, Mathieu de Costa, was chosen specifically because he could speak the local Mi'kmaq language.
The Mi'kmaq people were very welcoming people. The French needed the Mi'kmaq people to survive the winters. They would have starved without the Mi'kmaq people.
The history of Acadians, or French in Lunenburg County, is small. Initially, this was the capital of New France, what was called Fort Sainte-Marie-de-Grace, now called Fort Point Museum. Initially, the Mi'kmaq helped the French folks survive. And there was a lot of alliances formed because of that. And those alliances were because of the one factor was the fact that the French never really took it over. There was a trading relationship, and that trading relationship was cemented by some of those intermarriages that you spoke about. A lot of folks down in La Baie Sainte-Marie can trace their ancestry to Mi'kmaq folks.
When the British came over, they drove the French and the Mi'kmaq out of mainland Nova Scotia. Okay, so they fled in many different directions. My family fled towards Cape Breton. So from Cape Breton then, they went over to the Red Island, which is Newfoundland, and they fished off in Newfoundland. They were there for 3 generations. So my great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents were born on the island. And then they came home.
For hundreds of years, people have migrated to the area now known as Lunenburg in search of opportunity. For the British, it was the place to secure their dominion over the land they were claiming for their king. But the British didn't settle the area themselves. They did it by enticing groups of immigrants, mostly Germans from mainland Europe. These settlers were lured by the dream of escaping a feudal system and making a better life for themselves. Despite being a largely German settlement, the British left their legacy in Lunenburg's military layout of the town, its system of government and justice, and the prominent Anglican Church, or Church of England. Even the town name, Lunenburg, is derived from the fact that the King of England, George II, was also the Duke of Lunenburg, a link to his German origins.
Well, the very, very first is Jean-Georges Boutillier. He was born in Edebon in Montbéliard, which is a small province between France and Germany. And it was French, but they were Protestants. So it was very, very welcoming for Cornwallis to get all these people who were Protestants to come and, of course, replace the Acadians who had just been expelled.
So, your mother was a tanner and your father was a Myra.
But his mother was a tanner.
So you have tanners on
both sides. My grandfather and the tanner side on my mother's side, the men and all my cousins and uncles were tough guys. Tough guys, could fight, handle themselves, and no one shit on them.
My family was one of the original settlers. One of the first settlers coming to Lunenburg would have been my great, could have been another great in there, I'm not sure, grandfather Peter Zwicker. Originally they did settle in Mahone Bay, or what is now known as Mahone Bay, but then they came to Lunenburg. They established a salt fish business, and our family has been here since the founding of Lunenburg.
Well, it was certainly to get free land, and they were given a promise by Cornwallis that I think it was 2 years that they were going to look after them and have them settle eventually in Lunenburg.
They were governed by a landlord. They worked that land, and so this was a good deal for them. Once they got to George's Island in Halifax, off of Halifax, they had poor living conditions. They actually rioted and had a petition signed, and it was sent, I think it was sent to Cornwallis.
But they did get down here. They did have their land. There were issues with them surviving those first 2 winters. Many died. It was a really harsh time. But they came because they were getting something for free.
Yeah, 1 out of, I think it was 1 out of 5 survived. So it really took its toll.
My family came to Lunenburg in 1753. That's what we know, when Lunenburg was founded. There's a gentleman in Lunenburg who's a good friend of mine. His name is Ralph Getson. And Ralph and I would carry on that our families, the Getsons and the Creasers, came from Germany on the same boat. And Ralph will tell the story that the Getsons, when they left Germany, had some money, and by the time they got across the Atlantic, they lost all their money to the Creasers in a card game. So that's Ralph's story. I'm not going to deny it, but it sounds like a good story. I'm sure they had fun on their trip across the Atlantic. wondering where they were going and what kind of a life was ahead of them.
Of course, they spoke German, they spoke French, and they also had this Lutheran Protestant church. And Cornwallis went around all over Europe finding places where people could have those languages and were going to be quite happy to come and settle these areas in Nova Scotia.
But yeah, they came to the new land to set up farming and a better life.
Now you got to think about it, because these foreign Protestants, a lot of them were farmers. They were from the inlands of Europe. They knew nothing of the ocean. And so they traveled on the ocean to get here, and then when they get here and they finally come to Lunenburg, they must have just shook their heads, because if you stand on the wharf in Lunenburg, what do you see? Hills. Not good farmland, is it?
Dad was a young sailor from the northern part of Norway.
In 1940, the Nazis unleashed one of their notorious blitzkriegs, attacking Norway simultaneously from air, land, and sea. 30 Norwegian ships with upwards of 2,000 men, not knowing the fate of their families, sought refuge in Halifax's Bedford Basin. Hundreds of those sailors and many others eventually found their way to Lunenburg. Here they were welcomed, fellows of the sea. During the occupation of Norway, David Hansen's father tried to flee his homeland rather than be enlisted to work for the Germans. Aided by resistance fighters, he began the long and difficult trek to the officially neutral country of Sweden.
So the Nazis took his mother captive and were going to kill her. So the underground got word to Dad that, on this trek, and they were going across lakes and camping in brush blinds and what have you, that his mom had been taken. So he decided to leave the party and return and give himself up. But in the meantime, thankfully, they let her go. So anyway, he rejoined his party and eventually met up with 32 others who ended up in Sweden. And this is a chuckle, because Dad never liked the Swedish hockey teams, because Sweden supposedly at this point in time was neutral. But so they were held in Sweden for 6 months, much to my father's chagrin and everybody else. But eventually they were allowed to leave, and they went to England and joined the exiled Norwegian Navy and Norwegian merchant ships who were exiled under the king in England. And he served from 42 to 45 on Norwegian merchant ships, and actually was at Omaha and Juneau Beach in merchant ships. And never said much about it, but was quite proud of it, and today I'm quite proud of that.
Like many Norwegians, Robert Folvik's father worked on seagoing vessels. When Norway fell to the Nazis, the merchant ship he was on became trapped on the Seine River.
And on the way back up, they were going into France, into the Seine River, to pick up a load of red wine. In the process, they got stuck in the river. They had the wine picked up, so for I guess over a week, they basically drank, first of all, 3 days of red wine until the stomachs turned sour. And then finally the planes, when they attacked Paris, they came to the Seine and they were bombing along the river. So the boat made a run for it, and they got halfway down the river and they got bombed. There was 1 or 2 people were killed. They made it to shore. They got to Brest, and when Dunkirk was being evacuated, they got over back to England. Since they were Norwegian citizens, they found a Norwegian boat. They signed on there, and they came to Halifax. And in Halifax, he heard about Camp Norway being set up in Lunenburg, and he came to Lunenburg and enlisted in Camp Norway. My mother's sister married another Norwegian. My uncle that went through the War of the West Novies, he had brought back an English war bride. So there were 3 people in our family that were basically immigrants, and that was never really brought up that you were different or just part of life as I knew it. So, but I mean, they all were successful and they all fit in, and they're accepted within the town, and I guess after a war situation, things are a bit different than they are after 20, 25 years of peace. People just don't think the same way.
Over the centuries, Lunenburg has reaped the benefits of immigration.
The legacy of not only Dad, but the Norwegian community here has been long-standing in that they helped to grow the community. They were good citizens. They worked hard. They provided, they were shoe cobblers, seamen. There were captains, machinists. They worked in the Lunenburg foundry. They worked here at ABCO. They worked for National Seed Products. They were part and parcel of the community.
The buildings of Camp Norway continue to breathe life into the town of Lunenburg. Out of the ashes of war and loss has risen ABCO, a vibrant business now 70 years old.
But once the war was over, the property, I guess, was vacant and was surplus. So Canadian Crown Assets was engaged to dispose of the property. And my father and a group got together and decided that they would submit a bid for the property with an idea of developing a business for themselves here based in Lunenburg. So they were the successful bidder and acquired the property on February 2nd of 1947. So ABCO's been here 70 years on the property since this past February.
When I think back about what he did, I'm humbled. Because I couldn't have done it. When you think about kids today, not kids, but young adults or kids, look at this and say, oh. But they do not realize what war does to people and how it tears people's lives apart and how people then have to climb through that. And my father and all the folks, that you see, all the Mensons and Thalviks and all these had to climb through all that and start over, basically.
Lunenburg continues to welcome those searching for a peaceful life and an opportunity to thrive.
I was happy in Syria. I went to school. I worked with my father and I helped my family. I had a normal life, a simple life.
I went to school with my sisters. I lived with my family and I was happy.
The Syrian war brought disaster to both Ahmed and Isra's families. Thousands of innocent civilians, men, women, and children have been killed. Whole communities reduced to rubble.
To be a refugee is very hard in your heart. We didn't have a choice. We had to be there. There were almost 90,000 people living there. The air is not clean and you cannot take a shower. You cannot clean yourself or anything.
But even in such harsh conditions, there was light. Isra and Ahmed met in the camp and fell in love. Despite such harsh conditions, Ahmed worked on a gift for Isra.
This, I think, 4 months or 3 months and a half, 4 months. Work with a friend.
In the 1960s and early 70s, the world was changing. The Vietnam War, counterculture, shifting societal norms and values. A new age was dawning, and a new wave of people was being drawn to reimagine.
The way I came to the South Shore of Nova Scotia was that I was leaving the United States because of the war in Vietnam, and I was very much affected by and resisting that particular conflict.
We created Roots because David said he came from, like kind of ripping out his
roots, to come here, and then wanted to reestablish. And I felt I was returning home because I was born in the Maritimes.
There was also freedom to build one's dreams.
If you found an old fish store on the shore, you wanted to set up shop in it, for instance, as we did for the Black Duck down in Vogler's Cove, then nobody came along and said, "What are you doing here? Why, do you have a permit to open this shop? Well, people were just delighted you were making use of something before it fell into the sea. We're talking about the early 70s, and plenty of elderly people in their 70s, 80s, 90s then that could tell you stories of being out on sailing ships, of rowing dories and fishing out of dories. And they were like 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th generation. And they knew their history. They knew where they came from. They knew where they were on the earth. And they were very happy with that part of it. I remember going to one of the last barn dances on Upper Kingsburg and amazed that the people that came sang songs in German. And they didn't know what the words meant, but they remembered the words to the songs. So there was that sort of unbroken history that was very, very attractive to me. Lunenburg was just starting to bubble. And, you look at all the galleries and places to eat in Lunenburg now and so forth, and that wasn't happening yet in the early 70s, right? There was one place to eat, and there were no galleries. Or maybe there was one gallery.
For hundreds of years, few Acadians called Lunenburg home. But in the 1970s, a new group of Acadians began to move in.
However, when we first moved here, the Acadian culture wasn't very strong. But as time went on, it became a lot stronger, so that, like in recent years, we found a big difference.
Most of the kids in Lunenburg were of foreign Protestant stock. They were Langelos and Eminos and Crofts and typical Lunenburg County names that you'd find on the list of settlers that came to Lunenburg in 1753. And coming into Lunenburg Senior High School for an interview for a position that was mostly a history position, which was my degree. And I remember the principal being really impressed that I actually spoke French, because they had a lot of French teachers, but none of them spoke the language.
First day of school, when I first went to French class, the teacher we had, he wasn't much of a French teacher. So I put my hand up and I asked him for a book, and I didn't have a book, and he slammed his fist on the table and said, "In this class, we speak French, and French only." And I thought, I didn't think anybody here could speak French, so I rattled it off rather quickly, because as Cape Bretoners, we spoke pretty fast. And he didn't have a clue what I was saying.
The number of Acadians moving into Lunenburg County really increased in the 70s, when you had a lot of people coming in to work at Michelin, a lot of people getting involved, nursing, education, professional jobs, RCMP, to the point now where we have our own French school with approximately 250 students.
In the 1970s, crafts once necessary for survival were recognized as an important aspect of Lunenburg culture. The Black Duck Cooperative helped encourage preservation and honoring of these skills.
See, the Black Duck was a handcrafts cooperative, and it was the first handcrafts cooperative in Nova Scotia.
The Black Duck, again, brought people together.
And we saw this as an opportunity to really honor the people that still knew how to, and to hang on to the skills that these people had, their ancestors had developed and that they were carrying on.
I think it inspired other people to make other gift shops and other attractions.
Lunenburgers well know fishing is a dangerous job and a hard life. you have to be tough.
I started out at 18, right? Now, before that, I worked on a roofing gang, putting gravel roofs on for $1 an hour. I got a chance to go fishing Scotland at 18 when they made wooden boats and steel men. No shocking houses, no dump decks. You dug with your bare hand or gloves on, shoveled everything over with number 9 coal shovel, and when you shocked, the wind blew the shells back in your face. That's winter and summer, and when it got rough, the sea would come in over, wash you aside, and wash all the scallops out of your bucket. That was known to happen. And then I'd see we had a deck load of scallops, and it got so cold they froze you couldn't get a knife in them. Had to shovel them overboard. Yeah.
And some of those tough fishermen liked a drink or two.
I was in the tavern one. He went in the tavern. He always chewed tobacco, right? Big job. He was in the tavern. Bernie Mosier, who was still alive, said he made a lot of money out west. He had money. And he said to Pearlie, and then there come a tray, 25 glasses on the tray. Bernie said to Pearlie, if you can drink them 25 glasses in 15 minutes, I'll pay for it. Pearlie shoved the tobacco to the side of the note and drank the 25 glasses in less than 15 minutes. That was a funny thing.
Fishermen worked hard. The fishermen earned good money. We were known as, at the time, co-adventurers. So when you got your check for the fishing trip, you would usually go to the bank and you would cash it, literally, and take the cash out of the bank, and then you would go spend it. Car dealerships did very well in Lunenburg. There were stories of fishermen who bought cars and would literally smash it up before they went out, so they would have to buy a new car the next trip they came back in. Well, I mean, the waterfront in the 70s, we looked at pictures of Lunenburg and everything was gray. Everything was very kind of dreary. The main drive, which is now Blue Nose Drive, was a dirt road. It wasn't paved. It was almost like there were tumbleweeds blowing down the road. So that was what the community was. The waterfront was industrial. There was the smell of fish. There was the smell of fish meal from the fish plant. And that was the smell of money if you grew up in Lunenburg. Nobody was offended by the smell of the fish plant or the fish meal or anything around the waterfront, because that was the smell of everybody's livelihood. And if there was lots of smell, that meant there was lots of activity and lots of business.
Bridgewater mothers, lock up your lambs, for over the bridge comes the Lunenburg Rams. Sherman's figure headed down that, and he'd get that. And this was kind of true. So the Lunenburg guys would go over and get involved with Bridgewater women. And this was a little bit of rivalry.
Well, it was like any community. If you get a bunch of people having a few drinks, there's always the possibility of a rumble, I guess, among the locals and people from outside of town. If you could have been from the next town of Bridgewater coming into Lunenburg on a Friday or Saturday night, there could have been a rumble, and that could have happened any time, before my youth and after.
It's worthy of noting. When my grandmother died, grandmother Mrs. Tanner, and she had 4 or 5 daughters, and they were married, and some of their wives and their husbands came from Ontario down to the village of New Germany to go to the funeral. So you have the funeral, and what do you do afterwards with all these people? So, of course, my father was an overseas man, and he belonged to the Legion. So him and 2 or 3 of his brother-in-laws, which he doesn't meet too often, they would go to the Legion after the funeral. I remember quite clearly. And, of course, they drank a little too much. So no harm was done, but then their wives called my father down to the lowest and accused him of getting these grown married men intoxicated. It was a real kind of a sore spot that time.
They couldn't control themselves.
They couldn't control themselves.
He's a Lunenburg boy, From Lunenburg he be, Lunenburg's his pride and joy. She's the town for he. Some townsfolk dress real dandy, some townsfolk dress real tough, but he's a Lunenburg boy. He's really proud of that. The only dressing up he does is when he changes hats.
We always say about the kids, me and Ann, right? Mm-hmm. The kids now get all this computer stuff, right? When we were growing up, we had bicycles, went swimming every day of our lives out in garden lots, and had nothing. I got 10 cents a week to go to the show on Saturday afternoon. That was it. No candies, no nothing. That was it, 10 cents a week. And now you gotta have $1,000 a week. You know, so that's the difference. And we lived off the land, right? Always had gardens.
Peter Zwicker's father, very active in the community, had a good take on the Lunenburg way of life.
You know, he would share sort of things with me that, you know, for example, Lunenburgers don't like change. And, you know, the older I got and the more I was around Lunenburg, the more I realized that the community, while recently is embracing change, there was a period of time when people didn't want change. And so he was, you know, very sort of forward thinking that way. He was very, he was wise in, I think, in his years. And sometimes I'll remember things and I just call them Shermanisms because it's advice rather that he imparted upon me that I think is really quite relevant. And one of my favorite Shermanisms is advice not asked for is seldom taken.
Lunenburg is now attracting a modern wave of pioneers.
People were very much disbelief when they realized what we were doing, most particularly and amusingly, Vernon Walters, who was the third generation of blacksmith who inhabited this building. He was just incredulous when he thought that we were opening a distillery here.
For decades, Thomas Walters' blacksmith shop had been an important landmark, producing ironworks for shipbuilders all along the South Shore.
When we first arrived and he heard we were starting a distillery, his first comment was, "Oh boy, another failed business for my old shop." He was a little grumpy at the beginning, but I think once he realized that there were people coming to visit. He used to joke that by the time we moved in and opened our distillery, he was on so much medication he couldn't drink anymore. So he thought that was a little annoying. But in the end, he actually gave us one of his anvils. All the fabulous produce that we grow here was begging to be made into beverages beyond wines. And then as we're cleaning up the shop, getting ready to renovate, we get a bang on the door and somebody says, "Oh, I hear you're setting up a distillery. Are you going to make rum?" That happened repeatedly. People accosting us on the street or seeing us working out back and saying, "You're making rum, right?" With these big grins on their faces, and we had not intended to. But we soon realized that, okay, we're honoring the heritage here, we're honoring the history. We have to honor rum because it's so much a part of the nautical world here, the sailing world, the trade route, and what people drank.
Today there is a steady flow of young entrepreneurs choosing to make this place their home. Why Lunenburg?
We met beautiful people and we saw a real opportunity for young people to create jobs outside of the 9 to 5, and it's really working out for us that way.
There are new events and new ideas popping up and they're being widely accepted, so there's a new energy about the area that's very accepting and open-minded and allowing, and there's all kinds of different things being embraced, which is really exciting.
I was looking for community, and Lunenburg really felt right. It seems like a lot of young people are moving here and finding work, making a life for themselves, creating their own jobs, and that's what feels really exciting. Most people I know are starting businesses and are doing well. Well, I opened a shop 2 years ago. This building is an old fish shack. It was a gas and diesel storage shed. When I opened the first year, the door was my height, so we had to duck to get in. You know, it looks very quaint and kind of rustic on the outside. And people are always a little bit hesitant when they're coming towards the door. But when they get in, they're like, wow, what is this place? It's incredible.
I'm from Kabul, Afghanistan. I came to Canada in 2005 as an immigrant. And I studied in 2012. I graduated from Nascat University doing fine arts, major in paintings. And I came to Lunenburg actually after my graduation of university. There was a residency program called Nascat Lunenburg Studio, a residency program that was a year. So that's how I came to Lunenburg. This town actually really reminds me of my little town in Afghanistan. It was called Shahrara, Kabul. It's a really little town in the heart of Kabul city. So when I came here, I kind of felt like I was in that environment again. Because the benefit of living in a small town, it's easy. Things are so close. And the community, especially, you just walk in the morning and you greet so many people. And you just see your friends around. And that's really warm thing to be greeted in the morning.
That legendary small-town friendliness was a surprise for Ahmed.
Every day, say hello for me. Hello, every day. Everything in the road, hello, hello. But don't me. Don't know you. Don't know you. Hello, how are you? But this is good.
I like this too.
Is there anything you don't like?
Nothing.
I think the fact that this town really supports the artists, it plays a really big role for the emerging artist like me that I was in 2012.
I feel so lucky to be part of a community that is so supportive. So many people I know and care about come into the shop, are spreading the word. There's a whole group of women in business, young women in business, that come together and meet and support each other and brainstorm and come up with ideas on how we can grow.
I am an entrepreneur, artist, keeper of a drum, keeper of women's circles, and an active member of the community. I lived on the South Shore until I was about 18, and then I went to the University of Dalhousie and was recruited by TD Canada Trust to be a manager. I did that for a few years in the Greater Toronto area, and then I went on to pursue entrepreneurship. I was so involved in work that I left everything else behind, and I did that for almost 10 years, and I felt empty. I left my family, I left my culture, I left everything behind to pursue financial gain. And when I achieved that, I looked back and realized that I had nothing else.
Yeah, I think people are choosing lifestyle that, for me and a lot of people I know, they value time over money. So they're willing to have less, but, do more with their life. So, which is really inspiring to see.
Being on the South Shore, being home, allowed me to balance my life. So it was no longer just about work. It was about work. It was about my creativity and balancing my time.
For some who choose to live in Lunenburg, it is a homecoming. For others, it is a new adventure. In each case, it is a choice that promises a better quality of life.
What drew me back was the pace of life in Lunenburg. I had grown tired of the city. I wanted to get back to a place where I could, walk to the grocery store, walk to the local restaurant. When you passed somebody on the street, you actually knew who they were.
I was born in Halifax. I moved to Ontario in 1962 to go to university, and from university I ended up working down on Bay Street in Toronto. Well, the first connection was goes back a few years, 1753. My forebears were part of the original settlers who settled Lunenburg from Europe.
When we retired from Quebec, we decided that we wanted to live on a coast.
And since 2 of my 3 children were at that point down in Nova Scotia, our son looked around and liked the Lunenburg area, so we came down.
The cultural life here in Lunenburg was really beyond comparison. Our first thoughts were when we initially moved here that for any need for culture we'd be going to Halifax, but that was only an hour away, so it was no big deal. Well, we don't go to Halifax for culture, it's here.
The best thing for me about living in Lunenburg is the people, the huge, rich cultural milieu. There's everything. There's music, there's theater. It's great. And for me, I have my family and my grandchildren practically at my doorstep, often on my doorstep.
As you know, Lunenburg, like any small town, is a tight-knit place. So it's not the easiest to start getting introduced to people or getting to know people. So we my wife walked around the neighborhood and said, "We're having a potluck party on such and such a date. Please come over." And much to our gratitude and surprise, they did. They all came. They all brought stuff, and couldn't get rid of them until about 2 or 3 in the morning. That's how we started meeting our friends here in Lunenburg, and we're indeed friends to this day.
There is a bit of an issue with come from a ways sometimes, that the people, some of the people who grew up here aren't always as welcoming as the new people who've moved here, because the people who've moved here generally don't have a group already formed. So we form our own. And that's not to say that we don't also interact with the local people, and some of them have been amazing. If you are willing to make an effort and join things and be part of the community welcomes you with open arms.
You come into a town this small, and there are always going to be folks who have specific ideas about how things ought to be done. For the most part, I think because we came to the town with a very straightforward purpose, and we've created our business in a very self-reliant fashion, and we've not really expected anybody to dance to our tune, I think we've pretty much convinced any naysayers. I would say that what surprised me the most about Lunenburg was the degree of difference. I guess in my foolish, blinkered, Celtic, Cape Breton background, I had this vision that everybody wore tartan and did Highland dancing. It was wonderful and startling to realize that there were entire other cultures within the province.
I think Lunenburg has grown and has become a much more diverse community, and I think it's been good for the community. The economy of the world has changed. Lunenburg was pretty much a resource-based economy for a number of years. The fisheries started to falter. With the falter of the fisheries, the economy was a bit of the downturn in Lunenburg. Homes fell into somewhat disrepair, but over the last number of years, with Lunenburg becoming a tourist destination, a UNESCO Heritage Site, I think the community has grown and flourished. I think that we've had an investment in the community by people that are new to the community, and it's certainly been a benefit to the community. We've become a very diverse community, a lot of different backgrounds, educations, very strong arts and culture community. It's been good.
I think about immigration, whether it be in Canada or other countries in the world, because I think that some people are just sort of lacking in understanding that these people that are coming in obviously are coming on a duress. They have other things which they can offer. Any country receiving immigrants can benefit from immigration. Canada is a land of immigrants, and we've done quite well so far. It's quite natural that people are afraid of change, because you never know what change may bring. And there's always with change, positive change, just as well as perhaps a partial negative change. So we have to go with what's positive, because if we don't, what's life all about?
I guess I've always lived in an area that's been pretty much multicultural, and I love it.
So the life we've established here, the life type of life that Lunenburg offers, the interesting mix of people who have moved here from elsewhere versus people who have been here for generations, provides us with a most agreeable lifestyle.
Diversity is a wonderful thing. It's not a negative thing. It's good for our students. It's good for our province. It's good for our economy.
This is the sun country, no better place to be.
Now you caught a glimpse of history, yes, some recent, some long gone. Still spirits rise, first their home in the wind. You hear their song come.
This is our town, this is our home, this is the place for me. This is the sun country, no better place to be. This is the sun country, no better place to be.
Like many small towns, Lunenburg is a community deeply rooted in its own history. Though change can be difficult at times, Lunenburg has in fact continually transformed itself. How do small towns deal with change today? How will Lunenburg navigate the next wave?
If we could sit beneath the forest floor, we would see that all trees, the pine, the birch, maple, and so on, are holding hands, regardless of species. We as people, regardless of race, must come together and hold hands and help each other. We must listen to our Mother Earth. She is sending us a message.
My dream for Lunenburg is a place that remains, rich in heritage. That there are still beautiful, old, colorful buildings. That we don't have modern architecture coming in. I dream of a place where there's multiple age groups. That we're taking care of our old, and that the old are taking care of the young, and that together we're supporting each other, and making a beautiful lifestyle where people feel welcome. That different ethnic groups feel welcome. Different people of all color feel welcome.
As I look at our group trying to preserve language and culture, my sympathies go out for our Mi'kmaq friends who are having a hard time maintaining their language. It's a tough battle. So it's very important to maintain Acadian culture and Cape Breton culture and Mi'kmaq culture and all of that stuff, because if we water that down to the point where we're no longer different, we have given away something of value.
My hopes are that we realize that we're all one. There's no divide. There's no divide between religion and culture. And if we could only see that we are all interconnected in a web of life, and to share that with one another, to accept one another for exactly who we are.